I've been writing about Aminatta's work for a while, mostly focusing on The Memory of Love, which was one of her novels about the aftermath of conflict in Sierra Leone. But today we're going to be talking about The Hired Man, which is her new novel. And it was very exciting for me to sit down and read this novel. I had so many expectations, so many anticipations, but it was really interesting to see the way in which you were moving from writing about Sierra Leone to a completely different country. So you were expanding your literary horizons in some ways, but you were also, I think, consolidating on some themes that run through all of your work. So themes to do with conflict, themes to do with empathy, and particularly themes to do with cross-cultural empathy, which of course fits in with this idea of transcultural writing, which we're exploring through these series of talks. So I wanted to start off by asking you a little bit about the setting, about the Croatian setting for the work. How did you come across this setting, and how did you pick this main character duo that runs through the novel?
I'm delighted to be here, by the way. Also wonderful listening to Zoe talk about my work like that. She does it better than I do. I feel like I'm going to sort of fall short. As I was writing The Memory of Love, I was pretty certain that my next book was not going to be set on the African continent. Actually, I really only wrote about Sierra Leone. I set my stories in Sierra Leone. In fact, I'd go as far as to say writers don't write about places, they set characters in places. And so 3 books had been set in Sierra Leone. It seemed to me, of course, it seemed important that I write about Sierra Leone. People ask me why Croatia. If they'd asked me why Sierra Leone, I mean, everybody feels it's obvious because part of my family is from there. But actually, I wrote about Sierra Leone because nobody else was writing about Sierra Leone. That's really why I wrote about Sierra Leone. You know, if we had been a nation of writers, I might have chosen a different subject to begin my career with. So, but I had written 3 books, a memoir and 2 novels about that conflict and set in that country, and all of them really dealt with the prelude and aftermath to war. All of them, in one way or another, traced how a country implodes and looked at the consequences of that. And I mean, quite a few readers and critics, the majority I would say, were clear that these were universal stories and that Sierra Leone was merely the setting for them. But just enough didn't get it to irk me. And because, you know, because the stories were still being seen somehow as relevant only to Africa, I decided that, I mean, I won't complain about it too much, as I say, there were people, of course, who could read the things in a broader way, but I decided that I would take it outside, outside Sierra Leone. And I thought of a couple of places. I was on holiday in Spain when I was thinking about the book, about the next book, and I had written a short story for the BBC about an empty house in an unnamed country that wasn't even specifically European or African, but about an empty house in which which had belonged to a brother and a sister, in which a brother and a sister had lived. So, and there was a caretaker of the house in that short story. And the theme that I had been given by the BBC was envy. It was for the proms, and several writers were given a different theme, which was a different deadly sin, and mine was envy. And so I had already written this short story around the theme of envy in this empty house, and hinted at the nature of what had happened in that house. And I was in Spain on a prolonged holiday, actually writing a piece for Granta about war in Sierra Leone. And I began to think about the Spanish Civil War. You know, one of the things that came to pass after The Memory of Love was noticing in which countries the book had a particular impact. And one of the countries where all of my books actually had a big impact was in Spain. And of course, you know, when I went to Spain to give talks, I very soon realised that this was about civil war, that this country had had a 50-year silence, and we're only just talking about their civil war. And another place, for example, was Sri Lanka, which I kind of enjoy because of the people's confusion confusion Westerners quite often have between Sierra Leone and Sri Lanka. I was in Sri Lanka and people said to me, people quite often ask us if I'm from Sierra Leone, which was a joke in the memory of life. But anyway, there are different interesting places that appear to have no connection other than the fact they all had a civil war. So, I kind of thought a bit about Spain, and then actually I was simply at dinner. I'll pick up the Dura question in a minute, but I was simply at a party with friends of mine who were from the former Yugoslavia, and I had brought some Sierra Leoneans to that party, and we were all talking about civil war, and it was so apparent that we could talk about this subject in a way that the British people present simply could not. That war for the British was something that was fought over there, and it was about veterans coming back. Right, it was about wounded men coming back, but it really wasn't about the things that the Croatians, the Bosnians, and the Sierra Leoneans were so interested in talking about, which was mostly, who do you know who did what terrible thing that you could never imagine they would have done? That's really what we wanted to talk about. So that was actually, I looked around and about the ex-Yugoslav countries, and I lighted on Croatia really because that was where Westerners were buying holiday homes, where British people were buying holiday homes, and they weren't buying them in Serbia, and they weren't buying them in Kosovo, and they weren't much buying them in Bosnia, they were buying them in Croatia.